climate change is $1 trillion problem, which requires $1 trillion solution, India is the first to be really hard hit with climate change impacts. It may literally in the next 30 years be the first to become more uninhabitable.
So far, the way climate negotiations are happening, it's a blame game which is going on.
Ultimately, things are driven by financial incentives. It's in the economic interest of India to transition fast. It's in the economic interest of developed countries to pay for them. If we don't do it, frankly, our own survival is at risk.
Profit, the podcast where we discuss the world of sustainability and its impact on our lives, businesses, and planet. Today, we are joined by Dr. Alissa Kleinnijenhuis. She is a senior researcher, a climate finance professor, a member of the Sustainable Finance RPN at the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a faculty fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. So welcome, Alissa, to Planet People Profit. Before we dig into the serious issue, I would like to begin this podcast series with a question, a lighter one, where I want to understand. You have a stellar CV. And what does it feel like, to be dealing with so many positions and so many things in the world of sustainability?
Well, I guess it depends on where your heart lies. And in my case, I genuinely care about trying to find a solution to climate change. So, if I did this just as a job, I would probably be very tired at this point. But because I'm actually trying to bring a solution, all those engagements with different academic institutions, but also think tanks and public policy institutions are something that I actually very much enjoy because we need to ultimately maximally collaborate across groups to bring about a global transition.
My second question, Alissa, COP29 just concluded. And even though there was a commitment of $300 billion annually by the developed nations till 2035, but it is not being considered to be enough to meet the climate change mitigation targets, especially by the developed nations. So how do you feel, about the reluctance of developed nations to commit what is expected and what has been suggested by the climate finance economists and experts? And do you think that your work, the Great Carbon Arbitrage, suggests those measures that can actually make climate finance a win-win situation for all the parties?
Absolutely. It's a big question with multiple parts. So let me try to break it down in parts. So first on, whether the COP29 commitment is enough. And the simple answer is it's not, right? It's too little, it's too late, and it's of too many sources. So, let's maybe start with too late, actually. So I just put out a joint statement, I don't know if you saw it, with the leading or one of the possibly the leading climate scientists in the world, Johan Rockström, which is called the COP29 outcome and the delivery on, or the new quantified goal of climate finance and its delivery on the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement goal. And in this joint statement, which we put out after COP, we made it very clear that currently the remaining carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming is basically down to 200 gigatons, which at the current approximate rate of emissions of 40 gigatons a year will be exhausted by 2029. And if you assume a linear reduction from where we are today to net zero, staying within that carbon budget, we need to be net zero as a world actually by 2035. And what Johan Rockström explains is that 1.5 degrees, which is the ambitious temperature limit of the Paris Agreement, right? The other one is 2 degrees. It's not really a goal, it's a physical limit. So if we go beyond 1.5 degrees, we are at risk of very high climate extremes and also at risk of crossing a very significant tipping points. And I guess for India specifically, right, you are, I guess, already facing more days, for example, where it's extremely hot and humid. You might get more hot bulb events. Literally, India might be one of the first countries that may face more areas that are practically uninhabitable. So what we would have needed is climate finance at scale starting in 2025, also to make sure that countries such as India can implement ambitious, nationally determined contributions that essentially stipulate its climate plans that are aligned with the Paris Agreement goals and ideally the 1.5-degree goal. For example, one other paper I brought out during COP is to decarbonize its power sector, because we know how to do that. The technologies are there. There's really no excuse to keep running on coal, as it's still very heavy in India. So that's my point on too late. Now, too little, and I guess too many sources are a bit interlinked, because the idea was that developed countries would offer very concessional finance from their own public coffers, or ideally grant equivalent climate finance, that could then be used to, well, this is my own view, but pay for early closure of fossil fuels, but importantly to help crowd in private finance for renewables and other things that are necessary to reach net zero. So the idea was that public commitments of developed country finance to developing countries could be helped to crowd in private capital, for example, with blended finance. Now, in the ultimate agreement, essentially they agreed to, by 2035, which is too late, offer 300 billion from all sorts of sources, public, private, MBDs, right, multilateral development banks, other sources, whatever it is. And then actually the 1.3 trillion goal, which is also in the NCQG is New Common Quantified Goal of Climate Finance Agreement of COP29, it was also from private and public sources. So it's actually incoherent. The idea was that 300 billion should be public only, it should have been grant equivalent climate finance, but it was not. And so it's also then very hard to get to 1 trillion if you don't actually commit enough public funds, right? So that's my answer, I guess, on whether the NCQG is good enough. And the answer is it's too little, too late, too many sources. And then I think you had one related question that you also wanted me to answer. Can you remind me of what that was?
Basically, can mechanisms like the Great Carbon Arbitrage effectively demonstrate the economic feasibility of scaling up contributions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, right, like the question is, and let me take one sip of water. Why did COP29 not deliver, right? And I don't know. I haven't been inside the negotiation chambers, although I have, been in touch with those that were. But my sense is that one of the difficulties was that you needed to get a global agreement, right, where there was unanimous buy-in. And for example, the Arab negotiation group said we cannot mention fossil fuels. We cannot target any specific sector, including fossil fuels. So you heard the top developed country negotiators like Wopke Hoekstra, who is the top EU commissioner, and John Podesta, who was the top US negotiator, say, right, there's no way a deal is going to come together unless we can tie it to emission reductions. Because they understood that ultimately, if we want to take away the risk of climate change and also ultimately, avoid large climate damages and adaptation costs in developed countries themselves, if they think from a self-interest perspective, climate finance has to be tied to mitigation, right? It has to be tied to emission reduction, which is what they were not able to do. So one other thing I say is, adaptation finance is really important, climate finance, but mitigation is paramount, because if we don't mitigate, adaptation needs are going to spiral further, and also loss and damage needs are going to spiral further. So what my current idea is, and I haven't actually published it yet, so you will get the preview, but we're doing this with the same group of authors, is to basically say, well, you don't necessarily need a global agreement. You can form coalitions of the self-interested willing. This is also discussed in the Great Carbon Arbitrage, where you can have a group of developed countries, possibly excluding the US, because Trump is likely to step out of the Paris Agreement, that basically commits to providing climate finance at scale and in time of the right type, right? So grant equivalent to those developed countries that commit to credible nationally determined contributions or country plans of decarbonization. And I guess additionally there can be adaptation compensation, right? So the idea is that you can try to replicate something like the just energy transition partnerships that have been agreed with Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa, Senegal, and there's an ecology one now with Brazil. But you would make adjustments compared to those because they have been criticized, right? One is they were not at the right scale. And two, it was mostly concessional loans, which adds to the, as you later will ask me about, I think, the debt burden of countries. So you really want to make sure it's sort of grant money, right? You want to make sure it's grant equivalent so that you don't really add to the debt burden and you can compensate and sort of in addition, it cannot just be geared towards renewable addition to stay within the carbon budget and to decarbonize in time, which has to happen largely before 2035. We need to close fossil fuels early, but that's not going to happen unless you can compensate those who are left behind. So the workers of coal mines in India, but even, this is what our paper argues, even the coal owners, so that it's in their economic interest to partake and they won't block it. So I can, of course, I guess elaborate more. But maybe one thing to say is that this has, to some degree, been done successfully in Germany, where the German government had subsidies to phase in renewables, to incentivize the phasing of renewables. And they held auctions where they compensated coal-fired power plants for early closure. And these coal-fired power plants partook because they knew that what they would get from the auction was better in terms of money than what they would get on their business as usual. And then I guess the final thing to say, so what we basically are showing this paper is that striking such deals is in the economic interest, because mostly people tend to be driven by sort of their own incentives of the key stakeholders involved. It's in the economic interest of developed countries because the money that they would need to give is smaller than the climate damages and adaptation costs, the escalating ones that they would otherwise suffer. It's in the interest of financial markets to partake because now the public funds basically de-risk investments in developing countries where typically the cost of capital is still prohibitively high, so that they're willing to come in. And it's in the interest of coal owners and coal communities because they are made at least as well off as they would have been had they continued coal usage. And of course, another really, really important benefit for India is that coal is a massive air pollutant. So, actually my TA, Yukta Badana, she's from India. I think she's even in New Delhi right now. She showed me, I think, that in New Delhi, the air pollution level is like 76 parts per cubic whatever. Yeah, so that's a very bad for health. It is a huge cause of death. Right. So for India, right, why is it in the interest of India to partake in such a country deal and accept money and implement decarbonization? Because India is the first to be really hard hit with climate change impacts. It may literally in the next 30 years be the first to become more uninhabitable. And it is a massive, if you reduce coal, almost instantly air pollution, the benefits are almost instantaneous in terms of lower air pollution and therefore, much healthier population.
All right, Alissa, in your long answer, there are 2 to 3 points that I picked up. One thing you mentioned that several nations can come together and form their own groupings to negotiate the climate deals, even if Donald Trump walks out of the COP agreement. But my point to you, Alissa, is that United States of America is the world's richest and most powerful country. And of course, Donald Trump supports the fossil fuel lobby. Do you think it would be really possible for other nations who are actually dependent on their security, military security as well as economic security, they are dependent on the US? to actually walk a path which is not being followed by the world's most powerful nation. I mean, take the example of Europe. How do you think any of those countries, do you think they will have the courage to go against Donald Trump's diktats that he would be issuing? He just said, anyone who tries to have their own trading currencies, they be ready to wage 100% import duty. So he's not gonna allow any kind of climate negotiation that goes against the fossil fuel lobby. What is your take on this?
Yeah, I'm not fully up to date on his active retaliation measures that he's now, I guess, threatening with. What we are, I guess, arguing, and I know that there's a big appetite in Europe. I actually got a letter from the EU Commission in response to my joint statement, which to me indicates that they are very keen to take the lead. So I guess what we're trying to do within Europe, and I'm also, and talking about all the places that I'm a non-resident fellow at Bruegel, which is the leading EU think tank on economics. So what we're trying to basically do is to, work with the various institutions in Europe and try to make them step up and actually assume a leadership position without the US, right? And it's, in some sense, it's very much in the interest of Europe to do that. And frankly, it's in the interest also of China to do it, because they can become a global leader in the renewable transition, which sooner or later it's inevitable to happen, right? That's the one thing that most people agree on, is that renewables are becoming ever more cheaper. That's actually a paper by my former PhD supervisor, which is often quoted in The Economist. So you have these learning by doing effects, which you can model with the Wright's law, which have meant that over the last 20 years, with every doubling of renewable installation, the costs have come down by like 20-25%, and likewise for batteries. So, Trump's presidency will not be able to stop the renewable transition. But the question is, will it happen fast enough? Because we are under a time constraint set by the carbon budget, right? And so we cannot just wait, actually, frankly, until 2050. Or I think, India's target now is 2070 to get to net zero. It must happen now. And that's why, it's so incredibly important to have developed countries or other rich countries to step up, because indeed, developing countries, typically are not wealthy enough to pay for their own transition. But and they're right, like morally, they don't really have the responsibility to pay, obviously, because it's the other countries that pollute it. But what we're trying to say is like rather than saying, climate finance is a moral obligation, which is not a very strong incentive or impetus for developed countries to pay, because with morality, charity, you might be willing to give $100, but not $1 trillion, right? So we're trying to say with this paper, and we're showing empirically, that it's not just equitable for developed countries to help pay for India's, or actually completely pay even for India's transition. It is also in their own economic interest. And if you tie it like that, it becomes much more likely that they're willing to offer scale, because they know it is ultimately also in their interest, like it is in India's.
Right. Alissa, do you think that the climate deal would be more accepted to the developing countries like India if it was projected, or maybe, in a different kind of a manner? Because so far, the way climate negotiations are happening, it's a blame game which is going on. India, other developing nations, they rightly believe that, it's a developed nations, it's an industrial revolution that led to all this problem in terms of climate change. Whereas the developed nations say, no, in absolute numbers, now China and India are also polluting the world. So this stalemate, do you think that we need a new language of negotiation which allows both parties to come on a stage where they do not see each other as each other's enemies, or trying to extract something more out of each other in this deal?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what my previous answer was trying to allude to. I'm not denying the existence of moral obligations, right? And that, some have maybe polluted more than others, but I think I don't know if you call it brilliant, but like the insight that comes out from our paper is that, you can, when you focus the debate on morality, right, which is where that blame game arises from, you will never be able to find a resolution, because with morality, it's, you can keep on talking about morality and not settle anywhere. The fundamental thing that, that economists understand is that ultimately things are driven by financial incentives, right? That's also why, the renewable transition won't be stopped necessarily, because renewables are simply becoming cheaper. So people want to move there. So what Nobel Prize winner, William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for the economics of climate change, not the economics of the transition, but anyway, he wrote an American Economic Review paper in 2015 about climate clubs, and he wrote a Foreign Affairs article in 2020 about it, where he says, climate change is $1 trillion problem, which requires $1 trillion solution. So we need a robust incentive structure, right? And this is exactly what my paper is about. What it says is we can, like we can do for a climate carbon club, we can form a climate finance club, essentially, between the developed countries of the willing and the recipient countries of the willing. If you want to resolve that bickering, frankly, right, between developed and developing countries, who should pay, we need to move away from the discussion about morality and simply talk about economic interest, because the truth is, it's in every single country's economic interest to transition. And underlying that or above that, as you said, it's in the people's interest, right? So what we just want to show is that it's in the economic interest of India to transition fast. It's in the economic interest of developed countries to pay for them, right? So that's exactly where also my new paper will be about that. And I think if we move the conversation away from morality to economics, we will be a lot better off. And of course, last notion on that, there's of course a reason why we talk about morality, right? Which is that it's very much embedded, ingrained in the language of the climate negotiation. So, in 1992, when the first climate accord was agreed, the UNFCCC, there was this idea of like common but differentiated responsibilities, right? And that was taken up as part of the Paris Agreement. And also in the Paris Agreement, you constantly have language in each of the articles that, there are common but differentiated responsibilities, that developed countries should take the lead, etc. And that's all correct, right? But what we're saying is morality is not enough to get the action at scale that countries like India need. So let's talk about economics instead, acknowledging that morality is a thing. But when we anchor the negotiations in economics, it becomes a lot easier.
Right, Alissa. Alissa is just talking about the economics of climate transition, where you're saying that it's in the economic interest of India and other countries to become net zero as early as possible. India has set the date of 2070, but for the world, you are saying it's 2035. My question to you, Alissa, is that because your paper, The Great Carbon Arbitrage, it talks about subsidies and helping, compensating those coal companies and fossil fuel companies for transitioning from being in the business of dirty fuel to renewable energy. But there is one thing that I believe, Alissa, that gets ignored in this fact that, whenever someone has to transition, right? For example, I'll give an example. India's largest coal producer is Coal India Limited. You might compensate that company with subsidies and some climate finance to transition into renewable energy. But it is also a fact that not every company would be able to transition. And how will you deal with that fear? Because there are always inefficiencies in transitioning of business. Certain businesses might be able to take it off, and certain business will die. And does your paper answer these kind of inefficiencies? Do you address these issues?
I guess to answer your question let me take one step back and then I'll fully get there. So I think one of the big things that we are proposing in this paper and in the follow-up papers is that actually we should not be focusing on project-based finance to get an at scale and speed transition of a country. We need to, I'm also saying multilateral development institutions who have so far mostly done project-based finance and likewise for private finance, we need to move to a countrywide transition. Why? And then I'll get to your question, right? But essentially, like the way to think about it is that you know for India what its business as usual emissions would be projected to be if it goes on its current trajectory. But then what you can do is you can project how India's emissions would need to come down over time to be net zero in time, but also to stick within the carbon budget, right? So given that, you can basically say, okay, how can India implement that emission reduction? So, and this is a new paper that we're going to publish, and we'd love to share it with you. Which coal-fired power plants and other fossil fuel assets would need to come offline when to implement that emission reduction, and which are the most dirty that you might be able to phase out first, or the first that are willing to do it anyway. So you can basically specify the phase-out pipeline to implement that emission reduction. And then you say, okay, how do we make sure that India doesn't get an energy shortage? Because obviously that's paramount, right? You need to make sure that India at all times can meet its energy demand, including any growth in that demand because of AI or because of other population growth and so on. So you want to then replace that fossil fuel energy with renewable energy, so that you keep up with growing demand. So you basically specify the phase-in pipeline, not just of renewables, but also of batteries, short-term lithium batteries, and electrolytes that can produce green hydrogen for long-term storage and grid extension and so on. So you need to specify what is needed to properly replace fossil fuels and have a stable, sufficient energy system. So when you then think about compensation, as you mentioned, right, for early fossil fuel closure, there could be instances where it is the coal-fired power plant itself that would turn into the renewable provider. But in principle, what we're proposing is that this is done at the country level, and the coal-fired power plant that closes can just take the money and go home, right? They can decide to use that money and build a new business. But the point is that just like Germany did, the packages of compensation to close coal-fired power plant are in some sense separate from the package of compensation to build renewables in its place, which, if you think about it, maybe there's a particular area of India where there's just plentiful sun and there's a lot of free space. So you just want the Indian government to build a lot of that there. And it's not necessarily the old coal-fired power plant that is doing that. So what we are basically saying is you want to, the key thing is to make a country plan where you in advance specify the phase out and the phase in pipeline, what needs to be phased out when and phased in when, so that at all times you don't get an energy shortage, that you plan in advance, and that it's not necessarily, although it could be, the coal-fired power plant that becomes the renewable provider. It could be someone else. So is that a helpful answer?
Yeah, definitely, Alissa. But my next question is related to this thing only. The solution that you have suggested, it may work in a country like China where you paying a nation as a whole, and then that particular country decides, which how much of that money needs to be invested in setting up new businesses and how much of money is to be given as part of compensation. In a democracy like India, where there are so many stakeholders, any kind of centralized decision making becomes very difficult. In India, we have seen the issue of stubble burning by Indian farmers in the northern part of India. The government has been trying to reduce that thing, to ban that thing by putting penalties, by giving compensation to people. But eventually, it becomes a very political issue, and the government fears losing votes. And this is why any kind of energy transition becomes very difficult. We have seen the same kind of a thing in world's most powerful democracy, that's United States of America. Just the defeat of Joe Biden and the victory of Donald Trump has just turned the tables against the whole idea of climate finance. So, do you think that the world would have been able to take a better decision if large number of powerful countries, especially those who have the money and those who are supposed to take the lead in this decision making of climate change negotiations, they were not democracies? It's a very political question, but I want to have an understanding from you on this.
Yeah, and let me just ask you one question just to clarify that I understand what you mean. So are you saying that you're asking me whether it helps if the developed countries take the lead in paying for India's transition? Is that what you're saying? Or
no, I'm saying whatever tools and mechanism you are suggesting, they would rather function in non-democracies, because in democracy it becomes very difficult to take any kind of a decision to compensate people. India as a democracy finds it very difficult to convince all the people that okay, take this much money and stop indulging in practices which are against the climate, in terms of burning fossil fuel, or in terms of burning farm stubble, because I think the North India's air quality is poor simply because the farmers in North India, they've been burning stubble in their fields, and the Indian government has completely failed to stop them from doing so. And that's simply because every government, every politician in India fears losing the next election if they tell people to take any kind of a decision. Which is
No, absolutely. That's a very excellent question. And I'm not claiming I have all the answers, right? And I fully agree, right? Like the key thing is that, is to make sure that whatever transition package is being implemented is one that politicians feel they can implement because they would not lose their voters. And I guess, and it's not the full answer, certainly. But, one thing to say is, certainly without compensation, if you're just telling, coal-fired power plants and communities around it to shut down, that's certainly an election loser, right? So that is why we are saying that, if you want to alleviate political opposition and get political buy-in, it is critical to compensate them at least as much as they would have earned on their business as usual, if not more, right? Like in Germany, probably the coal-fired power plants are deemed to have taken home more than they would have earned otherwise. And that's why they did it. So I think, and in part, it's also a matter, I think, of, leadership, because what our paper shows is that it is in the interest of individual people in India to partake in that transition. In fact, they might be losing their livelihoods, if not their lives, if they're not, transitioning. So it's extremely, no offense, but it's extremely myopic not to transition, right? For your own sake. But I think it is important, I guess I don't know exactly how I would do it in India, but you can obviously break down, a countrywide plan into a region-wide plan, right? Like the countrywide plan can be a composition of region-wide plans, which itself can be a composition of city-wide plans, as long as they're coherent, where at each level you do that, phase out and phasing concurrently. And I think it's then really important to communicate one other thing, by the way, that I don't know if we didn't mention so far. We argue that as part of the compensation, there should also be retraining of the population for employment elsewhere, or, for the new industry that is arising, right? Or wherever else they want to work. So I think, it's really important if each region of India were to transition and basically offer that compensation, that is paired with essentially an educational program that really explains, to all the people, like, look, if we're not going to transition, you're already experiencing, I don't know, more droughts of your crops or more extreme rainfall. You already see that your harvest is often failing. If we're not gonna, and also, the asthma that your child has, it's actually because of air pollution. And if we're not going to do this now, in 5 years, it's gonna be 10 times worse. Right. So I think if you can explain that, and also, explain them, look, if you're adopting this new practice, right, or you're moving jobs, you're not being made worse off. You get more money than you would have otherwise gotten. And B, there's a credible alternative, right? Because indeed, you're kind of right. Like if you just say them like, stop, and even if you give them money, they may not do it. But if you also offer them a credible alternative, then with sufficient education, it could work. But I'm not denying, right? I'm not denying that it's not easy. But I guess I mean, one thing, and this is not necessarily developed country, but if one example that I like is JF Kennedy saying, let's go to the moon in 10 years before the decade is out. Or actually Emmanuel Macron saying we need to rebuild the Notre Dame in 5 years. And, John F. Kennedy explicitly said it's not going to be easy. It's going to be very expensive. And you need to be committed and willing to, not just in terms of hours, but, of your entire willingness to do this thing, which is hard and expensive. But I believe that by the end of it, we can come out victorious, right? And so I think likewise, this is the attitude that we must have, right? Like, it's not going to be easy, but with the right leadership and commitment. And actually, I think we should put a shorter timeline where, because 2050 is like kicking the can down the road. No, I think we need to be net zero by 2035 and basically get it, because we have all the technologies by and large, and the rest we can innovate. But we just need to get the people together to want to embark on this greatest challenge probably mankind has ever faced, and at the same time, greatest opportunity. Because if we don't do it, frankly, our own survival is at risk.
All right, Alissa, I want to put one interesting question that was asked by India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman recently. She just said that sustainability or climate change is not just about shifting from one fuel to another. It's also about controlling your lifestyle, because at the end of the day, it's all about what kind of lifestyles we live in the world. And the West, if you just look at the per capita income, I think United States of America has per capita income about $58,000. $58,000 actually means, they are consuming that much amount per capita of energy, right? And if you just look at India, we are just $2,700. If you go to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, it will be much less. So do you think that the ultimate way to be a sustainable planet actually goes through the road of consuming less and less and reducing the per capita expenditure, if not income, of developed nations?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I'm able to answer that, as in I haven't thought about it enough, but I do know that there are economists, right, who are saying that we cannot just, assume we can continue growing in terms of, everything like productivity, GDP, energy consumption, right? Like that's kind of, I think, the narrative that tech people would love to sell, that, right? Like we can sort of, with new technologies, we can just sort of innovate ourselves out of sort of a planetary scarcity constraint. And I don't have a full answer, but I do know that the one thing that is true about renewable energy is that it's a renewable, literally, resource, right? You can draw it from the sun and from the wind and from water. But of course, you need to build something to be able to draw it. And it turns out, as the energy transition report of the, I don't know who wrote it, shows, that there is, in principle, to power the entire global transition at current, at least until end of century projections of future growth in energy demand, there is sufficient raw materials in the earth to be able to power that global transition. Obviously, we need to make sure that when we mine that, right, we are also aware of biodiversity and local livelihoods. But one of the big points that this report makes is that you indeed have to mine renewable raw materials once, like copper and so on. But in principle, you can then recycle renewables so that you can keep using those same raw materials. Whereas with fossil fuels, you have to keep pulling that out of the earth, because every time you burn it, it's gone, and you have to continue doing that. and then it comes with all those environmental destructions that have to keep being repeated. So I'm not sure if I have a full answer to this, but I think that at least in the short run, we do not necessarily need to reduce consumption. We can actually make the transition globally, with the abundance, frankly, of renewable resources that we have by a combination of the sun, the wind, and raw materials.
All right, Alissa, thank you very much for talking to us on Planet, People, and Profit. It's the first podcast, and we're glad that you spoke with us. And we hope that the world comes to a consensus, a climate consensus, where the developing nations and developed nations, they come on the same page when it comes to deciding on who will finance the energy transition. And till that time, we hope you keep writing new papers and enriching our knowledge about climate finance.
Well, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to talk with you, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to your other podcasts as well.
Alissa, thank you very much for joining us.